Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the invisible framework that holds the British government together. We're talking about the powerful, unwritten rules that dictate how the country is really run. So, how can a modern democracy possibly function with rules that aren't even written down? Well, let's start with a question that gets right to the heart of how bizarre and yet how crucial this whole unwritten system actually is. Legally, the answer is, well, it's probably not what you think. It's yes. The king could technically veto a law. But in reality, no way. Absolutely not. And the reason why unlocks this hidden layer of power, a set of really powerful, unwritten understandings we call constitutional conventions. So what are these things exactly? The best way to think of them is like the essential rules of the game for politicians and monarchs. You won't find them in any law book, but they are absolutely critical to making the government work day to day. And this quote just illustrates the idea so perfectly. The laws, they're the skeleton, right? The rigid structure. But it's the conventions that are the living, breathing tissue that allows that skeleton to actually move and operate in the real world. What's really fascinating here is the difference between legal and political consequences. You run a red light, you get a fine from a court. Simple. But you break a convention, you get labeled unconstitutional. And in the world of politics, believe me, that can be a career-ending blow. Let's look at our first major example to see how this all works by focusing on the monarch's role. It is a perfect case of having massive power on paper versus very, very limited power in practice. Okay, so if you just read the law, it looks like the king could single-handedly block any piece of legislation that Parliament passes. I mean, that's an incredible amount of power for one person. But because of convention, the monarch always approves the laws passed by the elected Parliament. And why is that? Well, to do anything else would spark a massive constitutional crisis by just ignoring the democratic will of the people. In fact, the last time a monarch vetoed a bill was all the way back in 1708. And it's a similar story when it comes to appointing the head of government. The law says the monarch chooses the prime minister. Sounds like they could just pick their favorite person for the job. But you guessed it, convention steps in. The monarch must appoint the one person who can command the support of the elected House of Commons. It's a fundamental check that ensures the government is actually run by the people who were voted in. Now, this tension, this tug-of-war between legal power and democratic practice, it doesn't just apply to the monarch. It also defines the absolutely critical relationship between Parliament's two houses. So what happens when the unelected part of government, the House of Lords, disagrees with the elected part? That's where something called the Salisbury Convention comes in. In short, it's a rule that says the Lords can't just block laws that a government promised voters it would pass during an election. They can suggest changes, sure, but they can't veto the will of the people. And this is where it gets really interesting. This particular convention was considered so vital that parts of it were eventually turned into actual law. See, way back in 1909, the House of Lords created a huge crisis by rejecting the government's budget. The response? Parliament passed laws to permanently limit their power, basically turning what was a gentleman's agreement into a legal straitjacket. So, what happens when these unwritten rules get ignored or pushed to their absolute limits? Well, the consequences aren't legal, but they can be politically explosive. This brings us to a really core convention, one that basically binds the whole system together: ministerial responsibility. Just like conventions manage the power of the monarch and the lords, this one ensures the government itself is held accountable to Parliament. It's the linchpin of trust in the system. For a perfect and very recent example of this, you just have to look at the resignation of Prime Minister Boris Johnson in 2022. No court forced him out of office. He resigned because so many of his own ministers lost confidence in him, and they cited breaches of trust and convention. It was a complete political implosion, not a legal one. And here it is, the raw power of these unwritten rules, all distilled into a single number: 63. In just 2 days, 63 members of the government walked out. Just think about that. No law was technically broken, but the political fallout was so immense, the government simply couldn't function anymore. The unwritten rules had been pushed too far, and they snapped back with incredible force. So, all of this naturally leads us to a huge constitutional question. If these rules are so vital, so important, then why on earth aren't they just written down as laws? Well, the debate is a classic trade-off. On the one hand, yeah, writing them down would provide clarity, it would prevent abuse, and it would make them enforceable in a court. But on the other hand, you would destroy their single greatest strength, their flexibility. A rigid, written down rule just can't adapt to a crisis in the same way an unwritten understanding can. And that really leaves us with the fundamental question. In today's highly polarized political world, is a system that's based on trust and tradition still fit for purpose? Is the flexibility of these unwritten rules worth the constant risk of a crisis? That is the tightrope the UK Constitution is walking right now.